Somewhere along the endless wide expanse of the Russian frontier, a lone witness would later recall a moment so still it felt unreal. A column of men moving forward in silence, not because of discipline, but because sound itself seemed to vanish into the cold. No one at the time understood that what they were seeing was not just a military advance, but the beginning of something far more irreversible. The Grande Armée of Napoleon Bonaparte had entered a land that did not respond to ambition, diplomacy, or force in the way Europe always had. It answered only with distance, emptiness, and a kind of silence that pressed against the mind like weight. At first, everything appeared consistent with expectations. The scale was immense, the confidence absolute, the belief in momentum unshaken. But as the weeks passed, something subtle began to shift. Supplies that should have been sufficient began to feel scarce. Horses that once carried artillery with ease began to falter. Roads that looked manageable on maps stretched into conditions no map could truly capture. And still, the true nature of the campaign had not yet revealed itself. There were early signs, almost easy to dismiss at the time, small indicators that the environment itself was changing the rules of engagement. Reports from forward elements mentioned conditions that seemed exaggerated at first, descriptions of cold so sharp it altered movement, of fatigue arriving earlier than expected, of entire units slowing without any clear reason other than the land itself resisting progress. Commanders interpreted these as temporary obstacles, the kind that could be managed with experience and resolve. But beneath those assumptions, something far more decisive was already unfolding. It was not a single battle, nor a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual erosion of certainty. The army that had crossed into Russia believed it was prepared for hardship, yet hardship in Europe had never resembled this. The scale of distance alone began to reshape expectations. Villages became fewer, supply lines stretched thinner, and communication between units grew increasingly unreliable. Still, no one at the highest levels imagined that the true threat would not arrive in the form of enemy formations, but in the absence of anything predictable at all. As the campaign advanced deeper into the interior, the illusion of control began to weaken. Orders that once moved efficiently through the chain of command started to lose clarity as they traveled. Information arrived late, sometimes incomplete, sometimes contradictory. And with every passing day, the environment itself seemed to erase the advantages that once defined Napoleon's forces in earlier campaigns. Yet even then, retreat was not a consideration. The expectation was always that resolution would come through one decisive engagement, one moment where the opposing forces would be forced into submission. What no one fully grasped was that Russia did not function on the same logic. It did not offer a single point of resolution. It expanded distance instead of reducing it, absorbed pressure instead of returning it, and allowed time itself to become the most significant factor on the battlefield. In the midst of this unfolding uncertainty, rumors began to circulate among the ranks. Not of enemy strength, but of something far less tangible. Soldiers spoke quietly about the land changing their pace, about fatigue arriving without warning, about the growing realization that the campaign was no longer moving toward a conclusion, but deeper into an environment that did not intend to resolve anything at all. These were not official reports, but they reflected a truth that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And yet, despite these signs, the full reality remained just out of reach, as if the land itself was withholding the final understanding of what was happening. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of current positions and beyond the clarity of command reports, something irreversible was forming. And at the center of it all was a question no one could yet answer. What exactly had this campaign become, and why did it feel as though the deeper they moved forward, the less control they truly had? The decision to advance further into the interior was not marked by a single moment of triumph, but by a quiet continuation of momentum that no one truly questioned at the time. Orders moved forward as they always had, carried by confidence built from years of European campaigns where speed and coordination had always resolved uncertainty. Yet here, in this vast and indifferent landscape, those same assumptions began to lose their reliability. The movement of the army no longer felt like progression toward a defined objective, but like a slow immersion into conditions that gradually reshaped every expectation. The officers responsible for planning continued to rely on familiar logic, calculating distance, supply needs, and timing based on earlier experiences in Central Europe. However, those calculations began to show inconsistencies that could not be easily corrected. Distances that appeared manageable on paper turned into extended marches that drained both men and animals far more quickly than anticipated. Communication between forward units and command elements became increasingly delayed, not due to enemy interference, but due to the sheer scale of the environment itself. Messages that once took hours now required entire days, and by the time they arrived, the conditions they described had already shifted. Within the ranks, the initial confidence remained visible, but it was beginning to coexist with a growing awareness that something fundamental about the campaign was no longer aligning with expectation. The land itself seemed to resist interpretation. Reports from scouts described terrain that changed character without warning, where open ground would suddenly give way to conditions that slowed movement to a fraction of normal pace. Even experienced officers struggled to reconcile these observations with the operational models they had trusted for years. Still, there was no immediate sense of crisis, only a gradual accumulation of small inconsistencies that had not yet been connected into a single conclusion. As the advance continued, logistical strain began to surface more clearly. Supply convoys that had been carefully calculated in earlier phases started arriving with reduced efficiency. Horses, essential for transporting artillery and provisions, showed signs of exhaustion far earlier than expected. The cold, initially dismissed as seasonal discomfort, began to assert itself with increasing persistence, affecting not only physical endurance, but also the ability to maintain structured movement across units. Despite these challenges, the overall structure of the army remained intact, held together by discipline and the belief that each obstacle would resolve itself once a decisive engagement was reached. That expectation, however, depended on a fundamental assumption that the opposing force would choose to stand and fight in a conventional manner. Instead, what unfolded was a pattern of withdrawal that defied standard military logic. Each time contact was anticipated, the opposing presence would recede, leaving behind only emptiness and conditions that complicated further advance. This created a paradox within the command structure. The absence of direct confrontation did not simplify the campaign, it extended it. Without a fixed point of engagement, the operational plan became increasingly dependent on distance alone, and distance in this environment carried costs that were not fully understood at the outset. Within the ranks, conversations became more focused on immediate experience rather than strategic objectives. Soldiers spoke of the difficulty in maintaining pace, of the increasing effort required to perform tasks that had previously been routine. There was no single event that marked a turning point, but rather a steady shift in perception, where the environment itself began to feel like an active participant in the campaign. Even so, the official narrative remained unchanged. Reports continued to emphasize progress, and the expectation of resolution persisted within higher command. Yet, beneath that structure, a quieter reality was forming, one that suggested the campaign was no longer operating within the boundaries of conventional military understanding. It was becoming something extended, something without a clear endpoint, where the usual relationship between movement and outcome no longer applied in the expected way. As the advance continued deeper into the interior, a subtle but increasingly undeniable pattern began to emerge that challenged every assumption the army had carried from earlier campaigns in Europe. The expectation had always been that an opposing force would eventually present itself in a decisive confrontation, where strength, coordination, and experience could determine the outcome. Instead, what unfolded was an environment where absence itself became the dominant condition. Settlements that should have provided structure and resources were increasingly found deserted. Fields that once suggested agricultural productivity were left empty, stripped of anything that could sustain movement or supply. The army was not meeting resistance in the conventional sense, but rather encountering a deliberate absence of everything that normally defined a theater of war. This absence was not random. It followed a pattern that slowly revealed itself over time, suggesting an organized withdrawal that removed not only opposing forces, but also the infrastructure upon which any advancing army would depend. Roads led through regions where essential supplies were no longer available. Storage points that would normally contain provisions had been cleared before arrival. Even basic markers of civilian presence grew increasingly rare, replaced by quiet landscapes that offered no indication of recent habitation. Within the ranks, This created a growing sense of disorientation. Soldiers who had been trained to interpret movement through familiar indicators of enemy positioning and territorial control found themselves operating in conditions where those indicators no longer applied. The absence of engagement did not create relief. Instead, it introduced uncertainty because it removed the structure through which progress could normally be measured. Without opposition, there was no clear way to determine success or failure, only continued movement into increasingly unfamiliar conditions. Command structures attempted to maintain clarity by reinforcing logistical expectations, but those expectations began to lose consistency. Supply calculations that had once been reliable no longer matched the realities encountered in the field. Distances between resupply points felt longer than recorded estimates, not because maps were incorrect, but because the conditions of travel had changed in ways that were not fully captured by traditional planning methods. Weather patterns contributed to this shift, introducing variability that affected both pace and endurance, further complicating the ability to maintain operational cohesion. As time progressed, the absence of resistance began to take on a different psychological weight. In earlier stages of the campaign, movement had been defined by anticipation of confrontation. Now, movement existed without that anchor. Each day became an extension of the last, without clear indication of when or where a defining moment might occur. This created a gradual erosion of certainty, not through sudden disruption, but through continuous exposure to conditions that defied expectation. Reports sent back to command reflected this growing ambiguity. Progress was technically recorded, but the meaning of that progress became increasingly difficult to interpret. Advancing through empty terrain did not produce the same sense of achievement that had defined earlier military operations. Instead, it raised questions about the nature of the campaign itself, and whether the absence of opposition represented weakness, strategy, or something entirely different that had not yet been fully understood. Within individual units, attention shifted from strategic objectives to immediate survival within the environment. Small observations became significant indicators of change. The condition of supply lines, the availability of resources, and the increasing difficulty of maintaining consistent movement began to define daily experience more than any formal objective. Yet despite these changes, the broader structure of the campaign continued forward, driven by momentum that had not yet encountered a force capable of redirecting it. What was becoming clear, however, was that the environment itself was no longer passive. It was shaping decisions, altering expectations, and gradually redefining what it meant to advance through a region that no longer behaved according to familiar rules of engagement. As the campaign moved further into regions that once appeared on maps as supply corridors and inhabited settlements, the expectation of replenishment began to disappear entirely, replaced by a consistent pattern of emptiness that extended beyond isolated locations and into entire stretches of territory. What had previously been interpreted as irregular withdrawal now revealed itself as a coordinated method of denying continuity to any advancing force. Places that should have offered food, shelter, and logistical support were found stripped of anything that could sustain movement. Storage facilities were no longer functioning as reference points, and in many cases, even the structural elements that would normally indicate recent human activity had been deliberately altered in ways that made recognition increasingly difficult. The army continued to advance, but each step forward now required greater reliance on carried provisions and diminishing supply lines that stretched back across vast distances already traversed. The further the movement extended, the more pronounced the imbalance became between expectation and reality. Command assessments, still grounded in earlier models of European warfare, struggled to account for the absence of conventional engagement. Instead of confronting organized resistance that could be measured, analyzed, and countered, the advancing forces encountered an environment that consistently removed the conditions necessary for such analysis to even occur. This created a situation where progress could no longer be defined by territorial gain alone, because territory itself no longer provided the same operational value it once had. Reports from multiple columns confirmed a growing inconsistency between projected and actual logistical capacity. Distances that had been calculated based on average movement rates failed to account for the cumulative effect of terrain variability and environmental resistance. Even when forward movement was maintained, The cost of sustaining that movement increased disproportionately, creating a widening gap between operational planning and field reality. Within this gap, uncertainty began to accumulate in ways that could not be easily resolved through standard adjustments. The absence of resources in expected locations was not treated initially as strategic denial, but as temporary deviation. However, as repetition increased across multiple sectors, it became clear that this was not an exception, but a defining characteristic of the region through which the campaign was unfolding. The environment was no longer passive background. It had become an active constraint, shaping every aspect of movement and endurance. Communication between units reflected this shift in tone. Descriptions of progress were increasingly qualified, and confidence in predictive models began to weaken. Instead of clear expectations of convergence toward decisive engagement, there was growing acknowledgement that the operational landscape no longer behaved according to established principles of military advancement. The assumption that continued movement would eventually produce resolution was no longer supported by observable conditions. As a result, the psychological framework of the campaign began to shift in parallel with its physical challenges. Soldiers and commanders alike were forced to reconcile the difference between planned objectives and lived experience. The absence of confrontation did not produce clarity, but rather extended uncertainty across time and distance, creating a sustained condition in which each new stage of movement offered no guarantee of closure or stabilization. What had begun as an advance defined by confidence in structure and outcome was gradually transforming into an extended exposure to an environment that resisted interpretation, measurement, and ultimately, expectation itself. As the movement continued deeper into the interior, the growing strain on logistics and coordination began to translate into visible changes within the structure of the campaign. What had once been treated as a gradual extension of operational reach now began to reveal itself as a system under continuous stress, where each additional mile of advance introduced new layers of dependency that could not be easily stabilized. The absence of reliable local resources meant that every requirement, from basic sustenance to material support, had to be carried across distances that were no longer consistent or predictable. This created a condition in which the further the advance proceeded, the more fragile its underlying foundation became. Within this evolving environment, the concept of endurance began to replace the concept of maneuver as the central concern of daily operations. Units that had previously focused on coordinated movement and tactical positioning now found themselves increasingly occupied with maintaining continuity under conditions that offered no natural reinforcement. The expectation that the land would provide intermittent support through settlements or established supply points was no longer supported by experience. Instead, each location reached appeared increasingly disconnected from the logistical assumptions that had guided earlier phases of the campaign. As a result, the structure of planning began to shift from projection to reaction. Rather than preparing for anticipated engagement or strategic convergence, commanders were forced to respond continuously to conditions that changed faster than they could be fully documented. This created a persistent gap between planning and execution, where decisions were made based on incomplete or outdated information. The reliability of earlier operational models diminished as environmental variability introduced factors that could not be quantified within existing frameworks. Within the ranks, this transition manifested as a gradual change in perception. Tasks that had once been routine began to require greater effort, not because of direct opposition, but because of the accumulation of small inefficiencies that compounded over time. Movement slowed, not due to a single obstacle, but due to the collective weight of conditions that resisted stabilization. The absence of engagement, which had initially been interpreted as strategic advantage, began to take on a different meaning. Without confrontation, there was no clear measure of progress, and without measurable progress, uncertainty expanded into every level of operation. Reports sent through command channels increasingly reflected this ambiguity. Descriptions of conditions became more cautious, and confidence in projected outcomes continued to decline. The language of certainty was gradually replaced by language of approximation, as each new observation introduced variables that complicated previously established assumptions. Even in areas where movement remained possible, the cost of maintaining that movement continued to rise in ways that were not immediately visible at the outset, but became increasingly apparent over time. As this process continued, the distinction between operational success and operational survival began to blur. Advancement no longer guaranteed improvement in position, as the environment itself imposed constraints that limited the practical value of territorial expansion. The further the campaign extended, the more it became defined not by encounters or decisive moments, but by sustained exposure to conditions that resisted adaptation. This shift did not occur through sudden collapse or singular failure, but through continuous accumulation of factors that gradually redefined the limits of what could be maintained in motion. As the campaign extended further into increasingly unstructured conditions, a new phase began to emerge where the distinction between organized movement and fragmented survival became increasingly difficult to maintain. The operational system that had once depended on synchronized coordination across multiple units now faced a reality in which communication delays, resource scarcity, and environmental resistance combined to reduce the effectiveness of centralized control. Orders still existed, and command structures remained formally intact, but the ability to execute those orders with consistency began to vary significantly depending on location and circumstance. Within this shifting framework, the concept of cohesion became less about direct coordination and more about maintaining minimal functional continuity under pressure. Units that once operated as interconnected components of a larger strategic design increasingly functioned as semi-independent groups, each adapting to localized conditions that were no longer uniform across the campaign. This decentralization was not the result of a single directive or decision, but rather the cumulative outcome of sustained operational strain across extended distances. As these changes developed, the internal rhythm of movement continued to slow. The expectation of structured progression toward a defined objective became increasingly difficult to sustain as each stage of advancement introduced new variables that disrupted prior assumptions. Terrain variability, logistical depletion, and environmental resistance combined to produce conditions in which predictability was no longer reliable. Even routine processes required greater time and effort to complete, and small inefficiencies accumulated into broader systemic delays that affected the entire operational chain. Within this environment, the role of communication became increasingly critical, yet simultaneously more limited in effectiveness. Reports sent from forward positions often arrived after conditions had already changed, reducing their practical value for immediate decision-making. This delay created a growing disconnect between perception and reality, where command assessments were based on information that no longer fully reflected current conditions in the field. As a result, adjustments were often reactive rather than anticipatory, further contributing to the instability of overall coordination. At the same time, the absence of conventional engagement continued to shape the psychological and operational landscape in unexpected ways. Without direct confrontation, there was no singular focus point around which movement could be organized or evaluated. Instead, the campaign existed as a continuous extension of effort without definitive resolution, where progress could not be measured through standard indicators of success. This absence of resolution introduced a different kind of pressure, one that was not defined by immediate threat, but by sustained uncertainty over time. As conditions continued to evolve, the strain on resources became increasingly apparent, not through sudden depletion, but through gradual reduction in availability and reliability. The systems responsible for maintaining continuity of movement began to operate under conditions that exceeded their original design capacity. This created a widening gap between operational requirement and logistical capability, a gap that could not be closed through adjustment alone. Within individual units, adaptation became a constant necessity. Personnel were required to modify routines, redistribute effort, and prioritize immediate functionality over long-term planning. These adjustments allowed for continued movement, but they also contributed to a growing sense of fragmentation within the broader structure of the campaign. What had begun as a coordinated advance, defined by structured objectives and clear expectations, had, over time, transformed into a complex system of sustained motion under diminishing stability. The environment, once treated as a neutral backdrop for operational activity, had become an active factor influencing every level of execution. It imposed constraints that shaped decisions, altered timelines, and redefined what could realistically be achieved within the limits of available resources. By this stage, the campaign was no longer defined solely by its original objectives, but increasingly by its capacity to continue functioning under conditions that progressively reduce the margin between planned operation and practical limitation. As the campaign progressed into its most unstable phase, the conditions of movement reached a level where continuity itself became the primary challenge rather than a byproduct of operations. The structured framework that had once defined advancement had now been reduced to a series of disconnected efforts to maintain forward motion under increasingly restrictive circumstances. The terrain, already difficult to interpret in earlier stages, now imposed a level of unpredictability that affected every aspect of coordination. Paths that had been previously identified as viable routes of movement became inconsistent, not due to any single obstruction, but due to the gradual degradation of environmental reliability over distance and time. Within this setting, the concept of retreat was no longer a singular decision point, but an ongoing process that unfolded unevenly across different sections of the force. Some units maintained limited cohesion, while others operated in increasingly fragmented conditions, each responding to localized pressures that varied significantly depending on exposure and available resources. The absence of centralized synchronization did not occur abruptly, but developed through accumulated strain, where communication delays and logistical depletion progressively reduced the ability to maintain unified direction. As a result, movement became less about coordinated progression and more about sustaining presence within an environment that offered diminishing structural support. Reports from various points along the extended line of movement indicated that predictability had effectively collapsed as a reliable factor. Distances between reference points no longer corresponded consistently with expected travel times, and the absence of stable supply intervals introduced further uncertainty into planning and execution. Even when forward movement was achieved, it often did not produce corresponding improvements in operational stability, as the conditions ahead were frequently as uncertain as those left behind. This created a circular pattern in which progress did not necessarily reduce difficulty, but instead redistributed it across a wider area of exposure. Within this environment, the psychological framework of the operation continued to shift in subtle but persistent ways. The expectation of resolution through structured engagement had long diminished, replaced by an ongoing adaptation to conditions that offered no clear endpoint. Each stage of movement required increased effort to maintain basic functionality, as routine processes became progressively more difficult to sustain under cumulative strain. The absence of defined confrontation removed the traditional markers through which progress had previously been understood, leaving only the continuity of effort as a measurable constant. Communication between separated elements of the force reflected this gradual transformation. Messages became increasingly focused on immediate conditions rather than broader objectives, indicating a shift from strategic coordination to situational response. The reliability of transmitted information also decreased over time, as delays and environmental interference reduced the relevance of updates by the time they reached their intended recipients. This further contributed to the widening gap between perception and operational reality, reinforcing a cycle in which decisions were made under progressively less stable informational conditions. As the movement continued, it became increasingly clear that the campaign was no longer operating within the parameters of its original design. The cumulative effect of environmental resistance, logistical limitation, and structural fragmentation had redefined the nature of sustained movement itself. What had once been conceived as a structured advance had evolved into a prolonged condition of adaptation, where continuity depended less on strategic advantage and more on the ability to persist within an environment that no longer conformed to established expectations. By the time the campaign reached its final operational phase, the structure that had once sustained coordinated movement had undergone a complete transformation into something far less stable and far more fragmented. What remained was no longer an organized advance in any conventional sense, but a dispersed series of isolated movements attempting to persist under conditions that offered no reliable framework for restoration. The expectation of reestablishing control over the environment or reasserting previous levels of operational cohesion had gradually diminished, replaced by a continuous effort simply to maintain presence across an increasingly vast and unresponsive landscape. Communication between separated elements had become sporadic and often delayed beyond practical usefulness, resulting in a situation where individual units were required to interpret and respond to conditions without the benefit of coordinated oversight. This created a widening divergence in experience, where each segment of the force operated under slightly different assumptions, shaped by its immediate surroundings, rather than any unified strategic direction. The absence of centralized clarity contributed to a progressive weakening of shared operational identity, as the original structure that had defined collective movement was no longer consistently observable in practice. Environmental conditions continued to exert a persistent influence on every aspect of activity. Variability in terrain, weather, and available resources introduced a level of unpredictability that affected even the most routine procedures. Movement itself had become increasingly irregular, not through any singular disruption, but through the accumulation of small inefficiencies that compounded over time and distance. These inefficiencies, while individually manageable, collectively produced a sustained reduction in operational reliability that could not be easily corrected through standard adjustments. Within this context, the concept of advancement lost much of its original meaning. Progress could no longer be measured by territorial extension or positional gain, as such indicators no longer correlated consistently with functional stability. Instead, movement existed in a state of continuous tension between necessity and limitation, where each action taken to maintain continuity introduced additional strain into an already constrained system. Reports from various points within the operational field reflected this condition through increasingly cautious language and reduced confidence in predictive assessment. The absence of reliable feedback loops meant that adjustments were often based on incomplete or outdated information, further reducing the effectiveness of coordinated response. Over time, this created a feedback cycle in which uncertainty reinforced itself, gradually eroding the capacity for long-range planning. As the structural integrity of the campaign continued to diminish, the distinction between organized operation and fragmented persistence became increasingly difficult to define. What remained was a system operating at reduced coherence, where continuity depended less on strategic design and more on the ability of individual components to adapt independently to immediate conditions. This shift did not occur as a singular collapse, but as a gradual dissolution of previously stable relationships between command, communication, and execution. By this stage, the campaign existed less as a unified operation and more as an extended condition of sustained adaptation, where the original framework of advancement had been replaced by a continuous effort to function within an environment that no longer supported its foundational assumptions. By the final stage of the campaign, what remained was no longer recognizable as a structured military operation in any conventional sense, but rather a prolonged and increasingly undefined withdrawal through an environment that appeared to erase the distinctions between movement, direction, and objective. The original intention that had driven the advance had long since faded into the background of experience, replaced by a continuous effort to maintain coherence across scattered and increasingly isolated elements. What had once been a unified force operating under shared assumptions and coordinated planning had gradually transformed into a collection of fragmented groups, each navigating conditions that were no longer consistent across distance or time. Communication, already weakened in earlier stages, had become sporadic and unreliable, producing gaps in understanding that could not be fully reconciled through later clarification. As a result, decisions were increasingly made in isolation, shaped more by immediate surroundings than by any centralized directive. The environment itself had become the dominant factor in determining the rhythm of movement. Variations in terrain, weather, and resource availability no longer functioned as external challenges to be overcome, but as defining conditions that dictated what was possible at any given moment. Each attempt to establish continuity was met with new forms of constraint, not through confrontation, but through absence, delay, and gradual degradation of operational stability. The further the movement extended, the more pronounced this pattern became, creating a sustained state in which progression could no longer be measured in meaningful terms of advancement or success. Within this context, the concept of return or resolution began to lose clarity. There was no identifiable point at which the system had failed in a singular manner, nor any moment that could be isolated as the definitive turning point. Instead, What emerged was a continuous process of reduction, where each stage of activity introduced slightly greater levels of inefficiency and uncertainty than the one before it. Over time, these incremental changes accumulated into a condition that no longer resembled the original structure of the campaign. Observers attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events found themselves confronted not with a single narrative of collapse, but with a layered progression of diminishing coherence that resisted simple explanation. As the final remnants of organized movement continued to drift through increasingly indifferent territory, the absence of external opposition remained one of the most striking and difficult aspects to interpret. There was no decisive engagement that brought conclusion, no singular confrontation that defined outcome. Instead, the defining characteristic of the entire experience was the absence of resolution itself. Movement persisted, but without the structural guarantees that had once given it meaning. Coordination persisted, but in fragmented and inconsistent forms. Even time seemed to lose its previous relationship to expectation, as days and distances no longer aligned with prior models of understanding. In the end, what remained was not a conclusion in the traditional sense, but a lingering condition of uncertainty. The final state of the campaign did not offer closure or definitive explanation, but instead left behind a series of unanswered questions about how structured systems behave when the environments they depend upon no longer respond in predictable ways. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the realization that there was no clear moment when everything ended, only a gradual fading into conditions where continuation and disappearance became indistinguishable, leaving behind a silence that still invites the same question with no confirmed answer. At what exact point did the system stop being an army and become something else entirely that no one could clearly define?